Well, first of all, Shana Tova to all of you. It's wonderful to be able to speak to you today. After the tragic news yesterday of the passing of the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I thought I would tear up my sermon and give a eulogy. But the Shabbat, we don't give eulogies. But one thing I hope that the Yiddish expression, Aziz Olzana, Gute Beter für ganz Klal Yisrael, v'kol ha'olam, v'ganze Welt, that she should be a good interceder for us. And I can think of nobody better to stand before the judge than the great judge herself. A judge who, of course, combined chesed and gevura, justice and mercy, and she will be missed, and it causes, of course, a great new sense of upheaval. But what I wanted to talk about was something a little bit different. As is my custom every year, I call my brother and my wonderful family in Israel to wish them Shana Tova. I caught them just as the 3-week lockdown had begun. Israel has begun a 3-week lockdown for the entire festival season, and this difficult measure will hopefully bring down the recent large surge in infections, hospitalizations, and deaths due to coronavirus. And we too are in a similar, if less severe, situation in the Boston area. Nevertheless, it is painful to know that my brother's traditions will be interrupted this year. My brother and sister-in-law will not see their 4 children and 10 grandchildren in meaningful ways in the coming weeks. They are an observant family and will not benefit from the technology we thankfully have access to in so many ways over the holidays. It is precisely in this season, this festival season, from Rosh Hashanah through Sukkot, that Israelis and Jews everywhere gather together in large numbers in so many different ways, in shuls and Sukkot. In Israel, it's a time for tiyulim and mini vacations throughout the small country. Having lived in Israel and having family there, I keep very informed about the issues. I watch Israeli TV, and so much of what is going on there are mirror images of what is going on here. The continued surging of COVID-19, a ruptured economy, demonstrations against government policies, issues around school openings, racial reckoning towards Ethiopian Jews and African asylum seekers, and they too have had to deal with incidents of excessive police violence and acts of anti-Palestinian violence. And this week, the sentencing of a young Israeli to life imprisonment for the murder of a Palestinian family is one small step in dealing with the great divisions that plague both of our countries. This week also saw the beginning, and it's got somehow swallowed up into what's going on around the world, but this week also saw the beginning of the end of Israel's isolation from the Arab world. This week, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain entered into peace agreements with Israel, and it looks like other Muslim countries will follow in the near future. Now, none of the countries in the Arab and Muslim world are democracies or claim to be. Nevertheless, diplomatic and economic relations will create a two-way street, and Israel may have an influence on those regimes. For many of us of a certain age, we remember the earth-shattering event of Anwar Sadat's visit to Jerusalem in 1974, and the subsequent Camp David Accords and the Egyptian-Israel peace treaty in 1979. 2 years later, in 1981, Sadat paid the price for his efforts and was assassinated by his own people. And 13 years later, Yitzhak Rabin would suffer a similar fate, murdered by an extremist among his own countrymen. But many of us also recall the anxiety before that 1974 visit. As I watched the plane taxiing to a stop at Ben Gurion Airport, I recall thinking this all may be a trap, a Trojan horse, that soldiers with submachine guns would rush out of the plane and massacre all of the Israeli leadership assembled to greet the Egyptian president. Of course, I was greatly relieved of my anxiety and by the results achieved by breaking the taboo of creating peace with Israel, albeit a cold peace, but nevertheless a peace. I won't go into the history of the last 46 years since Sadat's visit, but it is important to note the Oslo Accords with the PLO in 1993, and a month later, another peace treaty, again a cold peace, but nevertheless a peace with the Kingdom of Jordan. And disappointments followed the Oslo Accord. Palestinian-Israeli relations broke down, and a vicious intifada uprising ensued in 2001, and which did not conclude really until the beginning of 2005. And by the end of the Second Intifada, in September of that year, Israel unilaterally withdrew from the Gaza Strip and opened up a confrontation with Hamas that continues to this day. Are the leaders of Hamas the spoilers who reject the two-state solution? I'll leave that to the political strategists to assess. I can offer no suggestions to the Palestinians at this time, but they may be playing the wrong hand at this time. As elsewhere, it is the crisis of leadership on both sides that stalls progress towards a two-state future. A younger generation of Palestinians want peace in a two-state solution, and the more the present regime in Israel fails to come to terms that the Palestinians, like the Israelis, aren't going anywhere, the deal can't be made. The younger generation wants to benefit from the opportunities offered by high tech and a new relationship with the Arab world, an Arab world that has disappointed Palestinian aspirations for decades. And I have observed a lackluster reaction to the news this week of the breaking down of Israel's isolation. This is in such contrast to what I described about Sadat's astounding visit and the Oslo Accords. Now, what may the factors be? Is it our preoccupation with the difficult times we are facing? Are American Jews identifying less with Israel, particularly under its current regime? Is it possible that these breakthroughs are seen as only political machinations of our current regime? Would there be more enthusiasm if these breakthroughs had happened under different auspices? I suppose that some of this may be the case. For the last decades, Israel has become a Middle Eastern country, and its new alliance with autocratic regimes in the Arab world is prompted by the old adage that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And it comes at an opportune time, I believe, to create a response to Iran and its support of the threat from Hezbollah in Lebanon in the north. Northern Israel, for those who have been following, has been on high alert for quite a while now. The divisiveness in Israeli society and the divisiveness in our society should not blur our support for Israel's future and our future here. Our current despair should not dilute our love for our ideals and the possibilities yet to come. We saw a breakthrough in Israel's isolation and should be supportive of it. Now, one of the reasons TBZ is a strong supporter of the Progressive New Israel Fund is our knowing that dealing with social issues must come from the bottom up. As we do here, we know that grassroots organizations are the best way to make sure that what comes from the top down gets to where it's supposed to go. Our support for Israel is not predicated on any one reason, but rather for me, personally, a deep connection to Jewish history, an emotional and intellectual commitment to the existential reality that Jews have a right to self-determination, and more than that. Israel is a unique amalgam of innovation and tradition that will continue to surprise us in the decades to come. Perhaps it might even help to create a new kind of Jewish secularism here, based on both the acceptance and the rejection of the tradition. Israel exemplifies the depth of our paradox of particularism and universalism. I am never shocked to hear that when there are catastrophes in many parts of the world, Israel reaches out to help. Israel, with all its deficiencies, is, as it was told to Abraham, a blessing for all nations. I am excited that the breaking of Israel's isolation in the world would bode well, not only for the Middle East, but for the entire world, and for the American Jewish community as well. Our connections with Israel must be strengthened, particularly in the progressive community, who often demonize Israel rather than recognize the many ways they can support progressive work that is being done in Israel with people who struggle to bring the necessary changes there as well as here. For all those who know that the goal is to create a more equal world, a world of mutual respect, it is very important for progressive Jews and non-Jews to get away from ignoring all of the great forces that are trying to come together to help Israel remain and continue to be a nation looking for progressive solutions to the problems they face. So all told, my friends, I want to end by just saying we have opportunities in front of us in spite of what we see, in spite of the sense of despair. These opportunities for Jews in the United States are not only linked to what we are doing here, but for the same issues that are facing also the state of Israel. We live in such a globalized world. Things cannot be that separate. So again, I urge all of you who see yourself as progressive to make sure that you try to get the non-Jewish progressive community to support all of the efforts done by Israeli progressives to improve our world, to improve the state of Israel. Thank you. I know it didn't have to do with the Parsha, didn't know it had to do with the Haftarah. I just felt it had to be said, and it had not been really talked about by many of us over the last week.